Thank you, Nicole. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Let's see if this thing works. Okay. I'm here to talk to you this afternoon about a public opinion survey that we recently completed that was actually released to the media yesterday. You may have seen it. Some of you may be asking, well, why a poll? What's that have to do with this? In fact, in simple terms, it's really a way of extending the kind of dialogue that's taking place at this conference to the broader population. And there's obviously no way to bring the broader population into the NAC, although I suspect Peter's working on that, and you may see that accomplished in the next year. But what a survey does, it's a simple way to really bring that perspective into the dialogue. And certainly our experience has been that public opinion research, if properly done and sensitively administered, can really help us understand our country better and help address some of the issues that we face. So how can it help here? Well, we could start with a fairly basic question. Do Canadians know today how to celebrate a momentous occasion? I think we got our answer about 2 weeks ago. And I think we learned something from that experience, and it was pretty positive. But I think there's probably more that we can learn than simply we know how to party when something great happens. So we did a survey. This was a typical national telephone survey of the kind that you read about all the time. Sample of 1,000 Canadians, coast to coast, balanced by demographics, done in the latter half of February, before the end of the Olympics, so that shouldn't have had too much impact. And this survey was made possible by MasterCard. They graciously sponsored the research and made it possible. And they were very perceptive in understanding that the 150th is going to be pretty significant to this country, and they wanted to be in at the beginning. So thank you, MasterCard. It's a fairly short, focused survey, about a dozen questions, and there were really 3 things that we wanted to look at. 3 questions. 1, what do Canadians remember about the centennial? And obviously, Nicole's father is one of them. Number 2, how do Canadians think we should celebrate the 150th? And 3, who do people think are responsible for making this happen? Let's start with the results. Now, I have to tell you that I myself did not grow up in this country. I grew up in the States. I wasn't around in 1967. I really wasn't quite sure what was going to come from this, but the results, I think, were really quite striking, at least to me. There we go. What we found is more than a third of Canadians, of the people that we polled, remembered something directly from the centennial in 1967. And another quarter had heard about it from other family members or whatever. So that's 6 in 10 Canadians have some memory, some recollection, know something about the centennial 43 years ago. As you might expect, the results do vary by age group. We would expect that, I think. The survey might not be valid if it wasn't the case. Look at the 60-plus group. 85% of Canadians remembered or heard about the centennial. That would be a higher number if we actually took out those people in that group that weren't in this country at the time, immigrants and so forth. So this is a pretty significant number. And I think what's also, one of the things that we asked the people that remembered was what they remembered about the centennial specifically. And this is one of these open-ended questions where we make people work. And what we could see that it's Expo 67, again like Nicole's father, the thing that was most likely to be remembered about the centennial. There are a number of other things also mentioned: community events, the new coins, the caravan, the Bobby Jimby song, and so forth. But a lot of people remembered something specifically that happened that long ago. Maybe as important, we also asked people what they remember feeling when that happened. What was their feeling at 1967? And a lot of Canadians, in fact, could remember how they felt. They felt proud, pride in Canada. They felt happy or excited. The shot here is of Bobby Jimby leading his parade of kids down the street. Some of you may remember this. And in fact, when I spoke anecdotally about this research, the people that remembered were talking about the song. The song was something they really remembered. A couple of my friends threatened to sing it to me, which I managed to escape. So clearly there was something here that brought something strong to the surface. What about the 150th? Now, this is not something that people were thinking about before we called them to do the survey, so there wasn't exactly a lot of people saying, we've been waiting for your call. But in the survey, we explained the fact that the 150th birthday is coming along in 2017, and what do you think? Should there be a celebration? Was this something very important to celebrate? And people very quickly grasped the concept. 9 in 10 Canadians in this survey said it was important to celebrate the 150th in important ways. And half, 49%, said this was very important. So even though people weren't thinking about it, they may not have known about it, very quickly said, yes, this is something that is important. And I think that's significant. And what's also significant is that this is not some particular part of the population that feels this way. If you look at results by age group, I think this is instructive because it's not just the old timers who have these wonderful memories of Expo 67 that are saying, well, let's do it again. But their children and their grandchildren are also saying, every bit as much, this is something really important for this country. If you look at it by income level, again, we might not expect these results, and there's a bit of a difference. But in fact, across all income categories, Canadians are saying, yes, this is something fairly important, we should do something. Now, if you look by language group, the results are a little different. We do see some differences. Anglophones are much more likely than Francophones to get excited about this idea, although even among Francophones, it's 60%. But I think what's most interesting here is to look at the allophones, those Canadians whose first language is neither English nor French. They're the most excited of all. These are people that weren't around in 1967, weren't born in this country, and yet they're the ones who are perhaps most excited about it. I think perhaps the most important question that we asked in the survey is, what is there to celebrate? What is there about Canada that really deserves celebration? So we asked this. We asked it in one of these open-ended questions, so people had to think and tell us what was in their minds. And most Canadians could think of at least one thing that ought to be celebrated. And this all comes down to about 5 broad themes. And the first theme, by far and away, 49% of Canadians identified some aspect of Canada having to do with beliefs and values, like multiculturalism and the Charter and so forth, that really ought to be celebrated. Number 2, people and history, Aboriginal culture and heritage, founding people, great Canadians. Number 3, notable achievements, arts and culture, the healthcare system. Number 4, our role in the world, things like peacekeeping and the fact that we're independent of the United States. And finally, our natural resources and natural beauty, 7% identified that. Let me just spend a little more time on this to give you some of the specifics. What really I think stands out is when you look at the specific responses, multiculturalism far and away is the number one thing that Canadians identify on their own as what ought to be celebrated. This is really quite striking. Charter of Rights is up there and so forth. But I think what's equally interesting is some of the categories or responses that you might expect to be a little more common that really aren't. Things like the healthcare system, peacekeeping, bilingualism, social programs, and yes, hockey. 1% hockey. Now, this was before the golden goal, so maybe it's 2%, I don't know. But I think that what this tells me is that when Canadians think about what ought to be celebrated, they're thinking about Canada as it is today, not about some romantic past that no longer exists. And I think that's a fairly significant finding. Now, I'm running out of time. I need to keep going here. We also floated a number of ideas that we wanted to get reaction to that are possible ways to celebrate the 150th. This is sort of about half the list. This is the percentage of Canadians that think each of these things is a great idea. At the top of the list, new scholarship program to help students attend college and university. Well, there's a novel idea. 51% thought that was a great idea. About a third thought that community events and programs, new improved infrastructure, travel programs, and major national events would be a great idea. So there's some interest here. If you look at the rest of the list, major public works projects, international expositions like Expo, multicultural programs, financial grants for arts and culture, public competitions to recognize excellence in art and culture, and new cultural facilities. These are all seen as great ideas, but by much smaller percentages of the population. So none of these ideas seem to be catching hold as a wonderful idea that most Canadians like, but they're all seen as in the realm of possibility. Let me move now to the final theme. Who's responsible for making this happen? We presented 5 sort of actors or sectors of the country, and what we can see here is that all of the sectors are seen as having an important role. 9 and 10 identify levels of government, companies, local governments, nonprofit organizations. They're all seen as having some role in this. although you can also see that the federal government is most likely to be seen as playing a very important role. That's not surprising given that this is something of national scope. And what about people themselves? While there are no events planned, there's no information, people just learned about this. If you ask people if they themselves are interested in participating, you get 80% basically of Canadians saying, yeah, I'd like to be part of this in my community. That's pretty significant given how vague this is at this point in time. And we also see that a significant number of Canadians, over half, are also prepared at some level to volunteer in their community to help make this happen. So certainly, I think that, given that this is well down the road and the fact that getting volunteers is always difficult, the fact that you've got this level of interest at this point certainly bodes well. So I am out of time. I want to finish with 4 really quick points that I think sum all this up and I want to leave you with. The first point is that very clearly the centennial in 1967 is still alive for many Canadians. They may not have thought about it for decades, but if you ask them or something brings it up, it comes to the surface and it's quite meaningful. Number 2, Canadians very quickly grasp the fact that 2017 is something important and should be an important milestone in this country, and they want it to mean something. I think that was very clear. Number 3, I think the Olympics shows us that the desire and the capability for feeling proud and celebrating is clearly there in the population in some way. And finally, while people want to celebrate, at this point in most of their minds, it's a blank slate about exactly what should we do. There aren't preconceived notions. There isn't some sense that it's got to be another expo or whatever. People aren't quite sure, but they want something. So the field is really wide open to governments, companies, nonprofits, and all of you to start thinking about this and start figuring out how you can perhaps stir the country's imagination and inspire people to relive something the way it happened at the 100th anniversary. Thank you very much.